Today, we're revisiting the New Zealand side of Train Simulator content to look at a freeware steam locomotive. As it turned out, she had already been publicly available for at least 4 months, but I had forgotten about her until a friend reminded me the other day. Here are my 2 cents on the New Zealand Railways P-Class 280. But first, a brief history of the P-Class. This was a batch of 10 locomotives built in 1885 by Naismith Wilson and Company of Patricroft, England, at a time when NZR needed more locomotives to handle their increasing workload and network expansion. However, poor communication between NZR and the manufacturer resulted in the Ps initially being overweight, so their introduction had to be delayed, and it wasn't until February 1886 when the first of the class entered service. Perhaps the most unusual aspect of this design was the frame, which extended a considerable distance past the smokebox, to the point where it's reminiscent of the SNCB Type 10. The Ps were primarily intended for hauling freight trains, and received numerous modifications throughout their lives. They lasted a reasonably long time in service, with the final example not being withdrawn until 1930, but that was 4 years after the Auckland-based engines bowed out. Instead of being scrapped, at least 4 of these locomotives were dumped as riverbank protection in Otago and Southland. In 1992, the remains of P107 and P25 were recovered from Beaumont on the former Roxburgh branch, followed 12 years later by the recovery of P60 and P133 from Branksholm on the former Wairio branch. From what I gather, a group called Project Steam is now working on restoring P107 at Middlemarch in the South Island. Prior to 2019, Project Steam was based at Springfield on the Midland Line. The P-Class was developed as a TS add-on by Mainline Models, and she's currently available to download from the Train Simulation New Zealand website. Links in the description. It's worth mentioning that this pack doesn't include all 10 members of the class, just the original 3 Auckland-based engines, numbers 268, 269 and 270, as they were from new until around 1900. Needless to say, they're quite a contrast from the motive power you'd see in the big city today. Based on my first impression, and upon comparison with a photograph of the real P268, I think the developers done a good job with the modelling and texturing. I especially like the brasswork on the steam dome, safety valve bonnet, and boiler banding. Meanwhile, the way in which you move around the footplate is really unusual. Instead of simply pressing the left or right arrow keys to change camera positions, you have to press Shift and either W, A, X, or D to move horizontally, and Control-Shift-W or Control-Shift-X to move vertically. I don't recall ever seeing a setup like this on any steamer I've previously tried in TS. I was pleasantly surprised to see that the P has numerous customizable details, an aspect of the engine that reminds me of numerous add-ons from Caledonia Works, such as the LMS Patriot 460, LSWR M7 Class 044 tank, and Linear A4 Pacific. According to the manual, the details you can change are the number plate style, the boiler cladding, choosing from green Russian iron or fictional black, the so-called acorn nut on the smokebox door, conrod big ends, chimney type, and safety valves. There's a number generator included with the download, and it'll help you determine the right number string for the details you want on your engine. Thinking back to the boiler cladding for a moment, I prefer how the P looks with green Russian iron instead of black. As for the chimney, I prefer a straight shooter over the original balloon, but each to their own. Personally, the only thing I don't like about this locomotive is her lack of crew figures and quick drive consists. As for the driving experience, this was easier than I expected, and I initially thought the P was going to be similarly harder to drive as the JA and KB. There is a manual supplied with the P class, and it's quite handy, as opposed to Petunia, for anyone who's not familiar with some of the engine's unconventional features. In addition to the standard steam locomotive controls, the P also has working sight glasses, Detroit lubricator, Hancock inspirator, and number 8 injector. There are no air brakes on this locomotive, only a handbrake and a steam brake, with the latter's control appearing to be non-proportional. In other words, your only options are fully applied or released, and I'm guessing this is realistic, but I could be wrong. As for the injectors, these are controlled a little differently from normal, but they're easy to manage once you get the hang of it. As for the sounds, these were not recorded from a real P for obvious reasons. I was told that the chuff sounds are modified from recordings of the preserved Y-Class 060 tank engine number 542, while the whistles were pitched up recordings from F180, who's also based at the Western Springs Railway with Y542. I like the animation on the P's whistle cord, even if mainly because it reminds me of when I was at the Steam Incorporated Open Weekend in 2023, and pretending to be a driver on J1234. At one point, I pulled the cord and noticed that it was still connected to the whistle, although it did nothing because the J wasn't in Steam. Thinking back to the old 280, there are several more animated components as opposed to just the whistle cord. These include the cylinder cocks, sanding gear, and brake rigging. In addition to all that lot, the valve gear also moves when you adjust the reverser. It's also worth mentioning that you can disable the lubricator simulation by pressing Ctrl-Enter. If only the JA and KB had this feature too. Of course, the P class is not the only New Zealand steam locomotive that's publicly available for Train Simulator. The others that come to mind are the Dubs A 040 tank of 1873, JA class 482 of 1946, and KB class 484 of 1939. The JA and KB are both payware add-ons available on Steam, while the Dubs A is just like the P, in the sense that she's freeware and available from the TSNZ website. The P doesn't include any scenarios, so when you want to run the engine, I'd say your best bet is to set up a custom free roam scenario, or make some quick drive consists if you know how to do so. As for any routes on which you could run this locomotive, there aren't many to choose from, and none of them are an 1890s era Auckland route. Unless you want to run the engine on the Japanese or South African routes, which also use 3-foot 6-inch gauge, your only other options, as far as I know, are Midland Line, Springfield to Aickens, that's a payware route available on Steam, or the 3 freeware routes available on the TSNZ website. One of them is the Pleasant Point Railway by Jets Griff, and I used this for most of my practice runs with the old 280, even if mainly because the frame rates here are a damn sight more consistent than they are on the Midland Line. In addition to the P-Class 280 herself, this video is also a plug for the D-Class 4-wheel coaches, another freeware product by Mainline Models. It's so bizarre seeing these things in Train Simulator, not just because of the blurst fictional variants that were included, but also because I've now seen, and ridden aboard, the preserved D26 in real life. For reference, this coach was built in 1874, and is now based at the Ferrymead Railway in Christchurch. In closing, I can easily recommend the New Zealand Railways P-Class to other TS Classic players, especially if they like narrow-gauge steam locomotives. This one has proven herself to be much better than I was expecting, especially for a freeware product, although I'm not saying that just because she's a New Zealand locomotive. The well-detailed modelling, complete with all the animated components that I showed you earlier, could easily rival payware add-ons. It's just a shame that there are so few New Zealand routes in TS, not to mention the lack of an era and region appropriate route for the P-Class. But regardless, I think this locomotive deserves an oddly specific 7.717 out of 10. If you've stuck around to the end of the video, you've won an extinct New Zealand bird that, for some reason, was also a big fan of the German band Rammstein. It's Du hast Eagle.